Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay, like through the mask and stuff? Awesome. Well, welcome to Brookline Booksmith for this very special event featuring Laura Kolbe and Zoë Hitzig, here to discuss Laura's new poetry collection, Little Pharma. My name is Adam, and I'm a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time being here, welcome. We so appreciate having you all in our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of Laura and an independent bookstore through your purchases and your attendance. The Booksmith has been here in Coolidge Corner for 60 years now, as of last year, and that is because of the love and support of folks like you. So thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for being here tonight. It is such a pleasure to have these two amazing people here with us tonight to talk about Little Pharma, a daunting journey from the depths of an institution and of a pervading personal dread to a renewed celebration of human contact, the body and the giddy, terrifying excitement of ongoing life. First, I want to thank our moderator, Zoë Hitzig, for being here tonight. Zoë is the author of the poetry collection Mezzanine. She's also a PhD candidate in economics at Harvard and lives just down the road in Austin. Thank you so much for being here with us, Zoë. And of course, our guest star for this evening, Laura Kolbe. Poet, physician, and medical ethicist, Laura is the author of tonight's featured poetry collection, Little Pharma, winner of the Agnes Lynch Starrett Prize. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Poetry, The Nation, and elsewhere. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further delay, please give a round of applause for our guests this evening, Zoë Hitzig and Laura Kolbe.
Thank you all so much for being here. It feels like a strange night to come together, but also necessary, I think, to try to find solace in each other's companionship and in art and in language. So I'm really, really grateful because I know it's not an easy thing to break away from the sort of slipstream of our lives and come here. So Zoë and I thought that maybe just to kind of settle ourselves, I'll read some poems and we can just spend a little time with that, and then we'll have a conversation, and then not too long after that, we'd like to open things up and really make it kind of a group polyphonic conversation, because I really would love to hear your words and thoughts tonight as well. So without further ado, I thought I would start by reading a poem called Little Pharma's Research, and the kind of autobiographical nugget that sparked this poem, that's a mixed metaphor, nugget that lodged a chunk in my brain, is about the kind of germinal experience very early in medical school when you are in the cadaver lab and spend a lot of time with a corpse in a very small group. And as many of you know this firsthand as physicians, but I remember how cognitively vertiginous it felt to spend kind of hours peering over these tiny, tiny little histological structures, or over the scale of one body, and then to kind of step out into the world outside and be thrust into different orders of magnitude visually and sensorially, and the kind of head rush of that experience being overwhelming and beautiful and troubling all at the same time. So, Little Pharma's Research. Sometimes when I leave the lab, what's outside seems some detail of anatomy still, as if always the metal gurney underlay the day. A man's jeans forming two blue veins coursing beside my bed. The lamp's sharp punctum where light spools under the fixture. Street noise leaking as through a weak wall in the heart. The anatomist's awe of layers above all. 5 skins between work shirt and rectus abdominis, hardly different from my skipping flat rocks, minding the many ways they waft out, then fall in, or my Skyping an old lover 2 skins, 2 apartments back. Of course, the reverse is just as true, like all the brightest lies. In the lab, I meet the rest of life, all the world packed in one corpse. The body, a kind of government, a flame-red senate wrapped in fur. Its provinces, all fens and rivers, two-bit hucksters stamping wet-booted outside the commissary store. Out along the farthest limbs, nerves open dovecotes for the wheeling flocks, homing, homing, home. When I first met my hands, their small largesse, they and I, we three, were amazed. In the lab's locker room, they peeled off my scrubs, glowed blue with a cold I couldn't yet feel, but knew as mine. Little match girls, little lights. What is there to love about this world without proportion? Impossible to tell if one body is 2 or 5, to tell whether, when I lie under my roof, it's about to slough right off, wizened epithelium, raw life lying beneath it, tasting the night as new syrup, serum sky. This next one I'm going to read is called Little Pharma Encounters the Spine. And it's not totally necessary to know this, but for a bit of medical context, one of the kind of emergencies you learn about in medical training is a phenomenon called cord compression. And so if there is a tumor or something else that is kind of taking up space where the spinal cord belongs and presses on that structure, it can be very rapidly dangerous for the person and for their spinal cord. And one of the ways that you might recognize this is if they lost both motor control and sensory control sort of distal to that space. And so I witnessed this a few times as a med student and as a resident, and it's always shocking and terrifying when this happens, but also made me reflect on the sort of beautiful parabolic function of the nervous system, that we have this incredible apparatus by which sort of sensory data sort of swings up from the tips of our being all the way up to the brain, and our kind of impulse to move flows from our brain out to the tips of who we are. And so that kind of pendulous parabolic motion kind of sets off the rhythm of this poem. Little Pharma encounters the spine. Power travels down and out. Feeling travels back. Not coal so much as dam. Not sex so much as combing his hair by fingers. Not the Charlottesville Exxon pumping the night into the night, so much as the black boughs of soda dispenser in the station's strange, eggy inner room, and the cups all froth-back response when the fountain's plastic levers cast, or the public tennis court uphill from the Exxon, shearing wattage on the players' lines, how it will scare up a game simply because light's coming down. Here not imminence, but vector, a chord you could hear beneath hearing, easy as crossing your eyes. Now cross, come in. This rope in bone broth, tender as a leg by Watteau, who can carry one behind the heart and not feel she must have plundered all this hid museum under skin? Lucky then to be bred collective in ignorance of breaking, in specied blithe. Mercy blanked as protein whites the fish's dimming market eye. Do not tell us we live fragile. The word eats sinkhole into bone. Mr. K, middle many years of age, forbade me speak it. When the tumor wedged alongside cord and spine, it wandered neck to floor, unmooring dermatomes. At first he lost the governance of breakfast, then world's slowest snowfall, sensation to the back. The morning he was called to surgery found him at the bathroom sink, attempting dance, clutching the faucet's chrome swan neck in sacrifice, and not to fall. When, pre-electric, we gave birds to gods, we must have known a snapped neck broke a downward power, emptied space for other currents in descent. We also, by this gesture, cut off feeling seeping center up. perhaps explaining why we never sensed an answer. Summer nights, faint hawking of tennis balls across and replied, sweet contagion colloquy. Who believes we will not have perception as a fleshly proper right? I'm sorry, Zoe. I'm just looking at your predicament. You just have to stand here looking attentive.
I'm completely absorbed.
Thank you.
I love these poems so much. It's like the whole room is disappearing as I listen.
Thank you. I'm going to read another one. And this one's called Little Pharma on Rooms because we brought it up earlier. This one, it's a very different experience trying to read aloud as opposed to on the page, because I think on the page you kind of see the stanzas of the poem, and stanza, of course, means room, that kind of sit visually very distinct from each other, and so you get a sense of them being almost hermetically sealed. And yeah, I mean, the room numbers are fictionalized, but I was trying to get at this phenomenon that I think can happen in medical training, where there's such a sort of fire hose of story that's coming at you continually, and so many different narratives, so many different cases, that it can be very hard to keep them all straight. But I think that the sort of ancient Roman orators were kind of right about their concept of a memory palace, meaning that there's something about the way we form memories when it happens in three-dimensional space, or if we picture ourselves moving through, a house or a palace or a hospital, that we form memories kind of geospatially in a very different way. And so I remember kind of forming these sense impressions based on what had happened in that room, even after that case had moved on. And the guilt that kind of comes with that, having a spatial memory as opposed to kind of a narrative memory, which sometimes fails us. Little Pharma on Rooms. She thinks in a smaller hospital she would remember each face. With some embarrassment, she can remember all the rooms. 1421. From whose eaves pigeons tumble, its permanent winter of shit, where she would like to put a thin strip of suspended garden. Something in love with guano, like hay, some ruffling infancy of color. 707. Where a couple lay in bed, one sick, the two now faceless in ozone hoods. The room wore its stretch of curtain, tight and broad like a bandeau in June. Unspeakable honeymoon, ringing for ginger ale all the time. 1603. With its own sitting room, a surplus of telephones, one almost expects a little home bar, silver shakers, a cigarette tray. 707. Where a couple lay in bed. Was the smaller one sick? Is that just farm logic? Its stretch of green curtain, smooth and stiff like a banker's lamp, amortizing a fixed account. 8:30. She thinks somehow she belongs there. Its shadows and somnolence appeal to her. The clock runs behind, the television sometimes stuck on a mass. Just its own digestion, plasma and diode. It is what she will ask for when sick. 11:18. Snow falls to water. The nurse's badge clicks on the bed rail with a bell's tread. The green fixtures spell nausea. Like a lighthouse, one sees the swing begin before the beams upon. 5:16. Surely the face here. It forms and jumps, pocket magnet startled by breathing. She grasps it, and it changes, faster than tadpoles. She shoves it, and it will not grimace, long enough to keep. I'm going to take a break from some of the more clinically oriented poems and just read one to give a sense of some of the later sequences in the book. And there's one suite of poems towards the final third of the book that are the imagining marriage poems, and they were sort of a way of working through or thinking about a philosophy of marriage, or a philosophy of really foregoing a sense of like the individual of oneself as kind of the primary unit of meaning, and being willing to relinquish that or exchange that for the idea of a duo or a multiplicity as being kind of the fundamental unit, like the personhood that counts maybe being collective rather than individual. Which is also, I realized after I realized that they seem to talk to the other poems in the book is something to do with medical training too, that like the I is maybe less important than the we or the us. So, imagining marriage. The bellies of right whales, each krill its jacket of mineral. One meal. The empties on Tillman Street. What they will make in their next heat is maybe a whale's glass cage, is maybe the largest bulb in Reno, is certainly a gray rash of nickels. Hello, goodly transmutation. Hello, my onus, my many. Two can be many. One can be two. At any siren, I still hail Mary, pastor's way of saying thy womb like thyroid, fast and ill-accounted. Though now I am praying to the box of noise, the string of women mimicked in its hosing peal. The low one with her black nosegay, the central matron strong as steel-cut oats, the soprano hem on fire, parched red, smoke-gingered. All these are you, says the ambulance, when not saying the more important move. And yet, to reduce, to make a vichyssoise of the large Babylonian heart, a feet, and all that ends in feet. Oh, thick rue, dumb as Napoleon in the goat hills of his mind, weaving one scratchy blanket for 200 or 300 million backs. We are apart. Yet, how good and still the bed can feel as you tug at my hair, 1,000 brown filaments, a single greased bobbin. How unreal to grab so much together. Today, in a space movie, a man in orbit tapes long strips of paper to his air shaft out of dying to hear the Russian grass. To you, it is all a sick dalliance with ghosts. Me, I want those streamers. I'm ready to glue them all over the house, drowning out even our shared and sleeping dog, our real trees, so that always it can be said, our listening is to splits and shards, is in pieces. And I think I'll just read one more for now and then we can break to chat. And I'm going to read one called The Countable. And this kind of takes as its starting point a part of the Gospels that I find really interesting, that's kind of theorizing an idea of God and thinking about, what if God is, he who or that which is like so infinitely attentive that even the fall of one sparrow or even, the presence of one lily more or less in the field is, that God would be, aware of that, and that kind of like infinite attention is what constitutes the divine. The divine is attention, and that those of us who are sort of non-divine, that what gives us our value is being objects of attention, and also I was thinking about how for clinicians, well, obviously that's sort of a hubristic and like ridiculous sort of asymptote to aspire to. I do think that like that is sort of part of the implicit culture perhaps in healthcare work, is this kind of striving for infinite attentiveness, however elusive or sort of impossible that is, and however fraught that can feel as an aspiration. So this kind of starts from the perspective of the bird, or rather watching the fall of a bird. Maybe some of you have experienced this if you have songbirds in your yard, but cardinals can be extremely territorial, and so if they see the reflection in the mirror or in a window, they will kind of fly at that hard surface until they kind of keel over, which is how this one begins. The Countable. Be among the countable, be scant as bird in air. Oily mutter of unreaping wing is enough. Dropping seeds that plants may dumbly grow is enough. Slamming glass, shiner to shine, when your bill hits porch window, your phantom rival flared up and gone. Sorehead, be master of thump and ding. That is enough to be counted in books of the living, maybe saved by a nut-brown hand, suet buffed, brought to a bosom of happy enumeration. I was doing my best at the breakfast table with boxed cornflakes and the last slug of milk when the first bird dropped, heavy as a child's trophy, its ember soaking air from my yard. It seemed my job to take note, its glass-skewed wing, its sacral rage, in case I was the Count's one deputy that day. What a god of suffering. I pulled the shade. I was ringing laps in a Sunday night grocery, everything smudged in the old week's rouge, soft in my belly as an oyster making love. It seemed no one could note, as I did, the dusty pecking of a man at the free cheese tray, how he studied the prices of capicola, took 4 toothpicks of Swiss, swizzled his brow, took 7 more. Of course I only watched, with no idea which of Knight's tollmen charged him on the cold walk home. Of course there is a count. Of course there is a shining booth where tickets are redeemed for fuzzy things, or simply someone holds your hand under a butter moon, tells you of your 5 fingers, whispers that even a 6th would be beautiful on you. Even a hand known to claw after gimcracks, beautiful. The toothpicks trailed him like frost at the edge of a department store fire, wholly white and still, while his ground floor of perfumes wrapped hoods of burnt sugar on the speechless. If I cotton to an ultimate mercy, it is one of 2-ply robes and hammered velvet, the kingfisher humming talus to the sunset, sure, but also many thin clerks and reeves, nervous to exist, an attic of abacuses dozing in crack-a-lore, a little behind time in their contributions flocked with eraser tongues. If I fall after you, it is because of the baked Alaska in my chest, which wants to be a tower of alternating pains snugged in cloud, but is running from an unplanned heat, its several colors streaming from the base. Count them. Before they mix to gray-brown, they are yours.
So good. Should we just do one little small? Let me I love the Countable. That's such a wild poem. It starts out like very like Gerard Manley Hopkins-esque, like unreaped wing, wimpling, whatever. You know, like just like having so much fun with language, looking at a bird, which is, you know, how so much of the poetry that, you know, informed us started, and then kind of descends into madness. The madness that comes with observation. So anyway,
Thank you.
I thought we could start with just kind of building off the Countable, talking a bit about the role of abstraction and anonymity in your work. You know, in the Countable, and then also in the poem about the rooms, where all of the rooms are numbered, there's this feeling that numbering things and looking at things from a sort of scientific remove is sort of the only way that, you know, the protagonist can sort of make sense of their surroundings and try to sort of make a way through the life of the day that they have to lead ahead of them. At the same time, a sort of central predicament that the speaker always finds themselves in is, you know, trying to understand the consequences of that removal or abstraction and what that might mean for the way they relate to others in their life.
Yeah, Whew.
Is that a
Where
question?
to enter that? Yeah. No, that's a very big structure. I'm trying to find like a little mouse hole to get in there. But yeah, I mean, I think one thing I think about a lot, both in poetry and in medicine, is about form and about heuristics and about what we sometimes call in medicine like illness scripts. So like little sort of cognitive shortcuts or vignettes or tidy sort of just so narrative formulas that help you get to the right answer quickly when it's urgent to do so. Which is kind of like, you know, how in poetry, like, I don't know, forms like the sonnet or the villanelle, like have very impersonal structures, or structures that maybe were at one point personal, but now at this point sort of belong to everyone and no one. And I think in both of those realms, what can happen that's like wonderful when you sort of allow yourself to use these ready-made forms, is that the whole idea is that sort of buys you back enough cognitive bandwidth, like enough kind of freedom of play, that then, you know, whatever sort of force of creative energy you have left, you can deploy it to kind of look for the odd detail that someone else has missed, or to kind of try to think beyond the ready-made and sort of perceive the sort of Sherlock Holmesian clue that sort of unlocks the whole thing. And that's kind of what writing can feel like in its sort of best iteration, is that by sort of borrowing these kinds of scaffolds, that you somehow paradoxically almost are able to kind of short circuit or sort of find the little wormhole that takes you to the unreal or the surprising, and it's a way of sort of shocking yourself into saying what you didn't plan to say. So I think that that's one sort of benefit of the impersonal or the ready-made or the structured, the formal and the constrained. And I find that incredibly helpful in composition. I think, I also think about the personal versus the impersonal sometimes when I'm thinking about language and register, and I try to be very conscious of that. And I think one thing that's really fun about being a poet who also has another vocational practice, and I'm sure this is the same for you as someone who's also an economist, is that you get to experience bilinguality, and you also speak other languages, so multilingual, polyglottism. You get to speak a lot of languages, and so it just multiplies the vocabulary, the lexicon that you have at your disposal, which is fantastic, because there's just, I mean, for me, as someone who just loves the sort of textured, the sensory qualities of languages, I feel like that sort of like, you know, meme of like Scrooge McDuck just sort of like swimming through like a sort of pit of coins or something. It's just, you're just like enveloped in linguistic treasure. It's delightful. But I think when I stand apart from my poetic practice and I think about myself in the world, I try to be aware of when I am deploying register in order like just to alienate or just to depersonalize. Because I think that is kind of a power move that sometimes we can be guilty of deploying, sometimes without even realizing. Sometimes it's almost like a subconscious distancing technique in order to sort of obfuscate or circumlocute around kind of the plain sense of things. And so sometimes I use that in poetry kind of knowingly to kind of think about the ironies of the ways in which we use language to kind of build fences. But I try to do that as critique rather than just willy-nilly, I guess.
No, and I think we're lucky that you're willing to bring us some of these delights that, you know, from your world, these pieces of vocabulary that we would never have an occasion to encounter in some ways. And I think it also sort of this book has amazing vocabulary even beyond just the medical stuff. Like in that last poem, The Countable, like attic of abacuses, dozing and crackalore. Just like so amazing. And I don't think those are medical words. Or is an abacus actually a medical thing?
Maybe for like Hippocrates or something. I don't know. I haven't used one in a while.
Yeah. So great. And I wanted to ask, so then, like, thinking about this, the role of the personal and like trying to find registers that are sort of not alienating, but are also sort of trying to bring a kind of experience to the reader in some way. I was also curious about sort of the position toward personal life that is projected in this book. Like in maybe the second to last poem you read, the Imagining Marriage one, we moved sort of out of the clinical settings more and into meditations on life and relationships, which you spoke about beautifully before you read that poem. And I wondered what the relationship of, the protagonist, who we can call Little Pharma maybe, what the protagonist's relationship to personal life is. Like the last section of the book, which has a lot of those personal, more personal poems, I would call them, starts out with a line that's something like, although the personal is perhaps beside the point. There's a kind of like erasure and sort of unwillingness to allow the personal to be meaningful in this sort of cosmos. And even in the first poem you read, Little Pharma's research. In that poem, sorry, I'm going on and on, I'm too excited. In that poem, there's sort of like the first half, and which is, I can't help but, a summary or précis would be, the speaker finds themselves unable to unsee the things that they see in the hospital in real life. And then there's a little bridge, and then the second part is the speaker finds themselves unable to unsee the things of the world in the lab, right, or in the hospital. And what's interesting there is that even when the speaker is unable to unsee what is in the world in the lab, it's not personal. It's sort of the social world of governments and war and, strangers on the street, rather than, particular interpersonal situations. So I just wanted to comment on that, which I find so fascinating, and see if you had any thoughts on it. And maybe going along with that, like, was it a conscious decision to sort of separate out those poems in a different section in the book, or was that accidental?
Yeah, so the poems are not arranged in kind of the chronological order of their writing, but as I was trying to figure out a kind of story arc for them, I feel like one that sort of emerged was the earlier poems tend to be in a slightly more defensed and kind of crouched position and feel overwhelmed and sort of unable to quite figure out what to make of the darkness of illness, or what can sometimes feel like the cold impersonality sometimes of clinical structures, and so they're sort of written from that space of tension, I guess, and sort of overwhelm. And then as the book moves along, I like to think that they start to become a little more able to have enough breathing room and enough kind of cognitive room to be able to let a little bit of play in and a little more light in, and be able to maybe even like simultaneously entertain, the all the lives that we live outside of those spaces, outside of the context of illness, outside of these kind of major thresholds of life and death and birth, and be able to experience more of those, the sort of interstitial tissue of life, which is like most of it, and even to be able to kind of end there and feel okay with ending there, in that the outside world. And so that's a little bit how it's structured. I'm trying to think where some of the other, there were so many great things not great things, there's so many things I wanted to say to your great points. Yeah, and so then you were talking about, give me
sort of I think that answer sort of answered to a lot of what I was asking about, which is the way that the personal is sort of pushed away for so much of the book.
Yeah.
And then it sounds like, and now it makes a lot of sense, sort of gradually maybe let in or sort of played with.
Yeah, but the other thing I wanted to say, and I think this is certainly true for my work in healthcare, but I think it's probably true for all of us, regardless of our vocation or profession, is that we are these kind of multifaceted, three-dimensional beings, and often we are kind of thrust into these occasions or scenarios or professions in which sort of one fairly slim facet of ourselves feels sort of like the admissible self, or the self that's kind of appropriate to the situation. And so, you know, for example, you know, in a clinical encounter, I don't feel like I'm necessarily revealing or sort of embodying like my entire three-dimensional chaotic self. Like, you know, I'm sort of choosing the sort of abridged version that's sort of the like donning the professional persona of like the doctor. And so I'm kind of being me, but I'm also kind of being like this sort of theatrical part in a way. And I'm sure that this is maybe true when you are like economist Zoe, you know, or graduate student Zoe, that like, you know, we're sort of giving people a selected edition of our entire selves. Yeah. And there's so many great reasons for that, obviously. But like, but I think done kind of too long, all of these other parts of self can feel like they're sort of attenuating, or, you know, it's like the side of your houseplant that is like not getting turned towards the sun enough. And so for me, like, you know, I hate to sort of reduce writing to just its therapeutic value, because I don't think that that's by any means kind of the whole of it, but I think it is the case that it is a way of kind of reintegrating and claiming those parts as being like just as real, like just as sort of like ontologically like dense and like really kind of with us and important as anything else. And so making room for that messy self, that kind of conflicted, ambivalent, like, you know, sometimes icky self, and saying that like this too is real and this too has a language and has a music, felt to me like an important sort of like flagged plant in the ground as the manuscript like continued to grow. Yeah.
And so maybe, well, I'll say one thing quickly and then I'll ask a question that builds on this idea of the theater of the self and, you know, alter egos. But before that, I just want to ask it, or sort of connect what you're saying to the wonderful image in the Imagining Marriage poem that you read, which borrows from Tarkovsky. Idea that, like, I mean, I just so love that image. It's the moment where the people on the doomed spaceship decide to put up these like streamers to try to remember what the leaves sounded like, what the wind sounded like as it went through the leaves. And I feel like that's just such a tender way of trying to like recall, sort of jog one's like visceral memory of a different self. And I wondered if that kind of relates to what you're talking about, and how to move between the two selves in some sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the poem, kind of as a room or as a space, and of course in life, you know, we're constantly trying to like plant for ourselves, find these little images or these little kind of crystalline epiphanic moments in which we feel somehow like more recalled to our heart's home, to kind of where we belong and who we are. And so sometimes, especially when I'm writing a long poem, I try to figure out where I can plant little oases almost. And so I think that often comes in revision, trying to figure out how to pace those so that when you hit these kind of switchbacks along the trail, that there's like a moment to kind of stop and you recall yourself to you know, the wind in the leaves. Even though, I mean, I borrowed that image from that movie because they're doing it in a sort of like doomed and artificial way. You know, like there's no actual tree in the space station. But the gesture feels like so human. Like that is what you would do if you in a larger sense. Hopefully not.
So the last thing, I don't know how we're doing on time. I don't want to completely monopolize. So the last question I'll ask is about Little Pharma as a character who speaks, who does research. Little Pharma who plays Lady Macbeth, or maybe is Lady Macbeth at one point. Little Pharma who learns about the spine and takes on all sorts of other activities and meditations in this book. I wondered if you could, and then we can open it up, if you could talk a little bit about Little Pharma. Is Little Pharma kind of the alter ego that you were describing just now, who's the Dr. Laura, is Little Pharma someone else? When was Little Pharma born? I mean, surely is Little Pharma Big Pharma's little sister? I don't know.
So I first hit upon that phrase when I was writing this poem, and the kind of conceit of the poem is sort of like, I feel like, I don't know, every 6 months, like the New York Times or something will run one of these slightly like fluffy pieces that's like, 20 words like we wish we had in English, but we don't, and it's like, well, in Icelandic, the word like blah, 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 means like the feeling after like your bare feet have been in front of the fire for 20 minutes or something, and, so there's these kind of listicle things that are like, we don't have a word for this, and if only we did, like how great that would be. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about it kind of in the context of like pharmaceuticals, like, like if we only had a drug that did like this precise emotional or psychological thing for us, or if only there was a chemical that could do, this particular thing that's just like so like messy about the way that we are as humans. And so that kind of created a slightly sort of listy catalog type poem about like, what if we had a Little Pharma for this and for that and for the other, and so that was called Little Pharma. But then I liked that turn of phrase, and I liked the way that it also potentially could kind of recall us back, or thinking about it as sort of like the antidote, or sort of the David to the Goliath of like the enormity of our systems of care and of health, and what if we could think of kind of the opposite of that, the sort of micro or like kind of hyper local and hyper personal. And so gradually, as sort of more iterations of those kinds of poems came out of me, it became sort of like an actual, sort of an alter ego, a character. And I found that really helpful because by displacing some things about me onto kind of a character that I could hold at arm's length, for me that's often a strategy of like tricking myself into being like more candid than I think I would actually be if I were kind of owning that as first person writing. It's kind of a clever way, I guess, not so clever, but a way of trying to get over myself a little bit maybe, and be able to kind of treat it as a stage and treat it as theater.
Wonderful. Well, I want to open it up. I realized I like completely took the mic. I had so many questions to ask about this book that I so admire. So now we'll open up for questions from the audience.
Thanks, Zoe.
I'll jump in first. I hope people can hear me with the mask. A question about language, because you speak many languages. This gets back a little bit to your answer about the identity, as the kind of the sliver of identity that you present as a doctor. I was noticing in the poems there's very little language that those of us who don't have medical training would not recognize. So I wondered, when, if ever, do you put your hand on the specialized language that you have access to as a doctor, or do you feel that you are trying to address some of those areas of your life that happen inside the hospital but without recourse to that language? And how do you maneuver around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on a very broad level, I would like some of the poems that are a little more technical in their lexicon to be able to be experienced, sort of at least two ways. Where maybe for a clinical reader or listener, they might be getting something a little more sort of anatomically or physiologically like formal out of it, and maybe some aspect of that image would not be apparent on the page to a non-clinical listener. But I want to make sure that when that is happening, that at the same time that it is still totally legible, hopefully psychologically and musically, at least that's the aspiration, to someone who maybe isn't going to go look that up. I think I do have some poems that I didn't read tonight that are a little more technical in that sense. There's some stuff about PET scans, there's some stuff about ultrasound, there's, things come up, but it felt very important to me that they could be sort of mutually intelligible across these sort of like STEM world and sort of, rest of world.
I think I learned what an ultrasound actually is from your poem. I don't know if that's like good training.
Yeah, I think you're
I'm
qualified
doctor,
now.
actually.
Yeah, you're actually a doctor.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
These were so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
As a fellow clinician, I write so many notes and read so many notes, and I feel like it's really sort of changed how I hear language and even how I talk and how I write. So I'm so curious for you how you feel like that's influenced your writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. I think a few different things. I think that again, the sort of ready-made quality of a note as a genre can be helpful or can be harmful for me as a writer and as a thinker. I think when it's helpful it's a way of making sure you didn't leave anything out, because it's going to take you through, this sort of, this trail in the hopes that, sort of nothing important will be excluded. And I think that that's a really fascinating artistic lesson, and really interesting to think about transposing that to different media and different art forms, and what would it look like to devise a system that is striving for that kind of ravenous, kind of curious completism. I think that that's really cool and a fun construct or jumping off point for poetry or for lots of other kinds of writing. I think you do sort of develop an allergy to kind of dead language, sort of received ready-made language, the kind of stuff that George Orwell sort of hates in sort of politics in the English language, these sort of icky sort of plasticine phrases that we all just use because they're at the tip of our tongue, because they're such available cliches. But I think that allergy is helpful too, because then I think when you come back to the page or to your easel or to wherever it is that you make your art, that having that little sort of Geiger counter going where something is going to start beeping when you slip into the land of cliche is fantastic. I think that gives you sort of a head start in trying to clear that stuff out. So that's how I think about that relationship. That I don't know, that maybe it has tuned my ear. And then also, of course, I write, my notes are not poetic notes, they're anybody else's. So I think that, there's fabulous reasons why we sort of use this common and simplified language in order to talk to each other. So yeah, there's sort of different goals, different things that we're doing when we communicate.
Do you get people who read your notes and are your colleagues and they're like, oh, I really thought this would rhyme?
Not to my face.
Oh. I get that a lot. It's annoying.
I'm so sorry.
Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your fabulous work sharing this with us. My question's related, and that is, I can see in your poems that you read how medicine impacts your poetry and is in your poetry in some ways. Experience there. How about the opposite direction? How does poetry impact the way you doctor?
Yeah, so many ways. I think maybe the biggest one is being a little more comfortable sitting with uncertainty than I might have been otherwise. Because I think poetry is really great sort of muscular training for uncertainty, because I think ideally when you write a poem, or I would say I think often you can kind of tell a bad poem or tell when things are going badly in your writing when you set out and you already kind of know the answer and you're really just sort of coloring in order to get to the predetermined conclusion that you've already decided is where you want the poem to end up. I think, at least for me, that tends to lead to very wooden writing that just feels kind of lifeless on the page. And I think for me, I've always been more successful when I really try to kind of maintain that beginner's mind for as long as possible and actually allow myself to be surprised by where the music takes me or by where the image takes me. And so when I come to my clinical practice, I try my darndest to replicate that. And obviously it's it's very much a work in progress, because I think we're trained sometimes to do that kind of fast thinking that very quickly brings us to the conclusion and rules out things as fast as possible. but I think to the extent that it can at least recall me to possibility and to open-mindedness and to being wrong and to being surprised, that is, I think, a strength in one's clinical practice. I don't know if I've achieved that, but for me at least that's the aspiration.
Wonderful. Maybe one more question? If there's one.
Hey, I love the poem about the rooms and sort of the way that the space, the visual space, and sort of like being in space with people imprints on your memory and just how that sort of sticks with you. And I'm conscious of how telemedicine has like changed the emotional experience of doctoring, and I'm wondering how it has changed the way that you use poetry to process the experience of being a clinician.
That's a fascinating question. So my practice has remained within the hospital throughout this time, so I have not directly experienced that, although I certainly have many friends and colleagues who have, and I've been listening to what they're experiencing kind of cognitively and psychologically, and I think it's really interesting. I think, it's very hard with that cropped and two-dimensional format. I wonder, kind of optimistically perhaps, whether, when you sort of diminish the sensory information available to one sense, maybe that heightens us in other ways, in the same way that sometimes people who have a particular disability in one sensory modality become, more sensitized and aware in other ways. I feel like perhaps that's an adaptation that we can make as a culture and in our practice, that maybe we become more attuned to the music of voice than we were before, or to the kind of shifting syntax that people use and what that might mean about what they're experiencing, or maybe we become better in the way that we frame questions or leave room for silence. I don't know. I think that's a lot to ask of people in the really rapid pace of the technological shift that we're experiencing now. So I worry that there will be this lag that we're all experiencing, where perhaps we will sort of develop new superpowers, but there's going to be a sort of catching up period. But that's absolutely what I hope. I don't know. What's your experience been?
Yeah, it feels like emotionally flat in a way. And it, the way that you were sort of describing being in the room, I feel that. And then when I think about the screen, I've like lost a lot of sort of like the tactile, emotional sort of like connection of making memories about relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, I think, as creatures, as like, animals that we are, I think memory has always been a kind of multimodal, multisensory experience, and it's very, very hard to figure out how to form them in the absence of some of those, without sort of the depth perception that gives us that other axis of dimensionality.
Wow, what a fascinating conversation and a beautiful book. Thank you all for coming and bringing your thoughts to Laura's wonderful work.
Thanks so much, Zoe.
Thank you to Brookline Booksmith for hosting us.
Absolutely. And I should say, I mean, this is surely apparent from just listening to Zoe, but she's a fabulous poet as well, and her book Mezzanine is also on sale back there.
I'm sure the authors would be happy to sign if you guys want to
Also
get some signed books.
that.
Yes.